It is our attitude toward life which will determine life's attitude toward us. Let's face the fact honestly that we shape our own lives, and the shapes of them will be determined by our attitudes. A person with a poor attitude toward learning, for example, isn't going to learn much until he changes his attitude. If we take the attitude that we cannot do something, we generally will not do it. An attitude of failure, and we're whipped before we start. So we know then that what we receive from life, what we accomplish or fail to accomplish, is due in large measure to our overall attitude. William James of Harvard
and the shining, sleek black roadster stopped within inches of each other at the street intersection. In the truck was a nice-faced man in his early 30s. At the wheel of the open car sat a mule-faced man of 60 plus. No damage done, an accident narrowly averted, yet the elderly man who had not given the other his right-of-way was now shouting at the very top of his voice, waving his hands with a fist in one, red in the face and almost apoplectic. It was over in a minute. The truck and the car parted. The well-dressed, apparently intelligent citizen of the community had thrown at the truck driver his last look of malevolence with intent to kill. The young man, who had listened silently to the other's tirade, leaning relaxed over his wheel, parted with these words spoken softly but with a suggestion in the tone that the advice he was giving was good. He said, "Old man, why don't you grow up? Be your age." The advice was excellent, but I'm afraid it came too late. The man in the roadster had grown up all right, but lopsidedly. There are many ways of growing up and becoming a well-angled individual. And according to the Dr. Steinkron, you must realize that it isn't just a question of the state of your biceps or whether or not you have lost all your baby teeth before you're on the way to sensible maturity. We grow in lots of ways or fail to grow, and each manner of growth contributes to the fullness of the life of the individual. There's the calendar age. No need to stress its importance, since it isn't too important. Then the mental age. This is dependent on our drive for self-betterment. The initial impetus is given us in school, and from then on, our degree of enlightenment and knowledge depends upon our innate desire to learn. Probably we know more about the physical age than any other. Suppose that a man whom you never met before sits quietly in a chair. You're asked to guess his physical age. You will usually guess the true decade, often come within a year or two of his birth date. But suppose you're asked to guess his mental and emotional age. Now, you can't do that unless he speaks. And even then it may require more than a few minutes before you have him cataloged. It takes time to dig down through the superficial layers of small talk to determine whether the undersoil is as promising as the top. For example, the boy in the truck knew he was talking to an old man. Even a baby knows whether it's looking at a granddad or at a boy across the street, but the young man in the truck had also divined something else. He knew at once that this older man was emotionally below par. So you can see there's more to growing up than just living, just getting smart, just being healthy. There's the emotional side, which is so important. And without its full development, there's an extreme difficulty in adjusting ourselves to the social life around us. It's well to remember that people's reactions are dictated by their states of mind and health. To be emotionally grown up is to learn not to get in the habit of taking everything as a personal insult. That man in the roadster probably argued with people all day because he thought they were picking on him. People don't pick on strangers. It just happens that the strangers get in the way of their feelings. And so we must train ourselves when young to be tolerant of others. We should intuitively, in all our human relations, each time step over into the other fellow's shoes, which is just the good old golden rule. For instance, don't laugh at people's peculiarities, because remember that after all, you yourself are a packet of subconscious reactions. That we're creatures of habit is another way of saying that often we're nothing but puppets who dance this way and that to the pull of the strings. Sometimes we can rear back and cut the strings. Usually, however, we go through life making the same motions. Live and let live is a good rule in all human relationships. It's invaluable when you're contending with the idiosyncrasies of your older fellow man. His habits have had time to gel. George Amos Dorsey wrote, "Normal old age should be only less delightful than youth. But premature senility is plain tragedy." I spoke with a middle-aged man a few days ago who's a good example of this tragic figure Dorsey wrote about. I knew before we'd talked more than a few minutes that he'd fit into this classification because of this statement. He said, "You know, I don't see why you spend so much effort in writing books which hope to prolong people's lives. You make life seem too important. As for me, I don't care if I die tomorrow," he said. Now, that immediately classified him in my mind as an unhappy man. And for a very old person to make such a statement may at times seem excusable. However, when a man in the 40s says it, then he's prematurely old. I think one of the chief manifestations of premature aging is this willingness to throw in the sponge, this perfectly unnatural acquiescence to surrender a great part of the few billion seconds we were given at birth. For only a man beaten in spirit, one in whom the daily waking is just another one of those days, can admit to a willingness to surrender this spirit.
Have you given much thought to the fact that you create yourself? You do to an altogether unsuspected extent, simply by the choices you make, by the things you decide to do or decide not to do. As Kierkegaard well said, the self is only that which it is in the process of becoming. So it is that an adult can stand in front of a full-length mirror and take a good long look at what he's created. We leave home and we form ourselves into new people, and we learn, as Thomas Wolfe learned, that we can't go home again, that we don't fit as well as we used to. We wonder after a visit as we leave to regain our own lives what happened, if something is wrong, what the strangeness was. It's simply that we're different now, and going back home again is like trying to get a 2-year-old shoe on a teenager. It's not going to fit anymore. We've shaped ourselves into new people, and we've done so by our own decisions. There's no going back, of course, and I guess most of us wouldn't want to, even if we could, although we're acutely conscious of mistakes we've made. We have to remember that each of us is new at this business of living and content ourselves with the fact that most of us have plenty of time to make good decisions in the future. If there's a rule in making decisions, I suppose it would be to listen to that inner voice and try to make decisions that tend to be growth-oriented. There's really no standing still, even if we'd like to. I wonder how many mothers in poor families have said to their children, "I want you to get an education and make something of yourselves." That old term, make something of yourself, carries with it the clear message that we invent, that we make, we create ourselves. I do think, however, that most really try to play it safe. That is, select those decisions which seem to carry the least risk of failure, and by so doing live out their lives well below their real potentials as persons. Sayings such as, "I'm not going to stick my neck out," and "don't rock the boat," to say nothing of the popular "take it easy" and "never volunteer," all indicate a reluctance to live fully extended or at the leading edge of life. In business, every time a suggestion is made that involves any sort of innovation, some old-timer will ask, "Well, who else is doing it?" He needs reassurance that the idea is not completely new, that it's been tested by someone else before he'll venture a yes vote. Professor Sidney Hook writes, "My observations lead me to the conclusion that human beings have suffered greater deprivations from their fear of life than from its abundance."
If any organism fails to fulfill its potentialities, it becomes sick, just as your legs would wither if you never walked. But the power of your legs is not all you would lose. The flowing of your blood, your heart action, your entire organism would be the weaker. And in the same way, if man does not fulfill his potentialities as a person, he becomes to that extent constricted and ill. This is the essence of neurosis. The person's unused potentialities. Now, I think that that's worth our making a mental note about. Think of that. This is the essence of neurosis. The person's unused potentialities. Blocked by hostile conditions in the environment, past or present, and by his own internalized conflicts, turn inward and cause morbidity. Now, here's something that William Blake said that I think we ought to have printed and emblazoned on our wall. Energy is eternal delight, said William Blake, and he who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. Now, I'm going to repeat that. Let's all remember that, because, golly, that could change a person's life, huh? Energy is eternal delight. And he who desires but acts not, in other words, does nothing about his desires, breeds pestilence. Kafka was a master at the gruesome task of picturing people who do not use their potentialities and therefore lose their sense of being persons. And the chief character in The Trial and in the Castle has no name. He is identified only by an initial, a mute symbol of one's lack of identity in one's own right. And in the staggering and frightful parable Metamorphosis, Kafka illustrates what happens when the human being forfeits his powers. Now, the hero of this story is a typical, empty, modern young man who lives a routine, vacuous life. In this case, he's a salesman, returning regularly to his middle-class home, eating the same menu of roast beef every Sunday while his father goes to sleep at the table. The young man's life was so empty, implies the author, that he woke up one morning no longer a human being, but a cockroach, because he had not fulfilled his status as a man. He forfeited his human potentialities. A cockroach, like lice and rats and vermin, lives off others' leavings. It is a parasite, and in most people's minds a symbol for what is unclean and repugnant. Could there be any more powerful symbol of what happens when a human being relinquishes his nature as a person? That's powerful, isn't it? That's what happens to a person when he does not use his potentialities, when he does not use his energy. Because, as William Blake said, energy is eternal delight. And it is. And I really believe, and I think you'll agree with me, that most people, if they don't know that, is because they've never tried. Now, remember what this fine psychiatrist said when he wrote this. If any organism, now that includes the human organism, a human person, fails to fulfill its potentialities, it becomes sick. But to the extent that we do fulfill our potentialities as persons, to the extent that we do fulfill them, we experience the profoundest joy to which the human being is heir. When a little child is learning to walk up steps or lift a box, he'll try again and again, getting up when he falls down and starting all over again. And finally, when he does succeed, he laughs with gratification. And his expression of joy is in the use of his powers. But this is nothing in comparison to the quiet joy when the adolescent can use his newly emerged power for the first time to gain a friend, or the adult's joy when he can love, plan, and create. Plan and create. Joy is the effect which comes when we use our powers. And here's something I liked very much. Joy, rather than happiness, is the goal of life. For joy is the emotion which accompanies our fulfilling our natures as human beings. It is based on the experience of one's identity as a being of worth and dignity, who's able to affirm his being, if need be, against all other beings and the whole inorganic world. This power in its ideal form is shown in the life of Socrates, who was so confident in himself and his values that he could take his being condemned to death not as a defeat, but as a greater fulfillment than compromising his beliefs. Now, we're not trying to imply that such joy is only for the heroic and the outstanding. It is as present qualitatively in anyone's act, no matter how inconspicuous, which is done in an honest and responsible expression of his own powers. Well, now that's the point I wanted to make. This was written by Dr. Rollo May and is in the book Man's Search for Himself, published by Norton, which is considered a classic in its field.
Lin Yutang, the famous Chinese philosopher, wrote, "We do not know a nation until we know its pleasures of life, just as we do not know a man until we know how he spends his leisure. It is when a man ceases to do the things he has to do and does the things he likes to do that the character is revealed. It's when the repressions of society and business are gone, and when the goads of money and fame and ambition are lifted, and a man's spirit wanders where it listeth, that we see the inner man, his real self." Had you ever thought much about that? Your leisure gives you away. I used to know a man who was head of a very large commercial empire. Beginning with nothing but ambition, he became a multimillionaire and finally retired as head of his far-flung company. He bought a large and magnificent yacht with which to cruise the world. And do you know what he did with his free time? He read salacious paperbacks and got falling down drunk and had to be carried unconscious to bed every night. He's dead now. His leisure gave him away. There was nothing there, just nothing at all. He was a one-idea man. Once he was away from that idea, he was a lost child in the wilderness. He didn't enjoy his yacht or his time. Travel meant nothing to him. He was a pitiful, unhappy cipher. His millions, which could have given him access to the whole world, were worthless to him. The thing that's always bothered me is how a human being can live for 30 or 40 or 50 years and find no interest, no charm and excitement in the world. Talk about wearing blinders. I guess it has to do with the way a person looks at life. If it's nothing more to him than getting through one day after another as best he can, that's one thing. But if he's searching for meaning, well, that's something else. It doesn't mean that he'll find it, but the search, the journey itself, can be filled with interest and excitement. When FDR first took office as President of the United States, one of his first acts was to call on the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was admitted to the old jurist's chambers and found him reading Plato. Justice Holmes was in his 90s. "Why are you reading Plato, Mr. Justice?" the President asked. "To improve my mind, Mr. President," the great judge replied. "To improve my mind. What do you do with your leisure time? It's a good idea to examine carefully this important segment of your life. It exposes the real person, but not the finished person. We can change. We can, like Justice Holmes, still be growing and improving our minds at 92. I don't mean we need to read Plato, although it's an excellent idea, but to find fulfillment, meaning, and interest, we need to grow towards something. When we stop growing, like my millionaire friend with a big yacht, we get sick and die. We may stick around a few more years and go through the motions, but for all practical purposes, we've really ceased to live. We do not know a man until we know how he spends his leisure. It is when a man ceases to do the things he has to do and does the things he likes to do that the character is revealed. It is then we see the inner man, his real self.
According to the Bureau of Standards, a dense fog covering 7 city blocks to a depth of 100 feet is composed of something less than 1 glass of water. That is, all the fog covering 7 city blocks 100 feet deep could be, if it were gotten all together, held in a single drinking glass. It would not quite fill it. And this can be compared to our worries. If we could see into the future, and if we could see our problems in their true light, they wouldn't tend to blind us to the world, to living itself, but instead could be relegated to their true size and place.
And if all the things most people worry about were reduced to their true size, you could probably put them all into a water glass, too. It's a well-established fact that as we get older, we worry less. We learn that with the passing of the years and the problems each of them yields, that most of our worries are not really worth bothering ourselves about too much, and that we can manage to solve the important ones. But to younger people, they often find their lives obscured by the fog of worry. Yet here's an authoritative estimate of what most people worry about. Things that never happen, 40%. That is, 40% of the things you worry about will never occur anyway. Things over and past that can't be changed by all the worry in the world, 30%. Needless worries about our health, 12%. Petty miscellaneous worries, 10%. Real, legitimate worries, 8%. Only 8% of your worries are worth concerning yourself about. 92% are pure fog with no substance at all. But how do you know which is which? Well, it seems the first thing to do is to stop concerning yourself with things which have already happened and about which there's nothing you nor anyone else can do. Forget them. This is the one that the experts claim does most to wreck marriages. The wife or husband will nurse and cling to things which have happened or have been said in the past and keep exhuming them like desiccated corpses. If the collection gets large enough, and it could easily get large enough in even the best of households, if a person never forgets every little slight or oversight or word spoken in impatience or anger, the marriage will wind up on the rocks. The largest cause of all arguments in the home, incidentally, is worry about money. And this wouldn't be such a problem. In fact, it could be a source of gratification if we could just learn to live within our means and save a part of every dollar we earn. It isn't easy, but it will get rid of the worries and most of the arguments about money. Ben Franklin said there are two ways of solving money problems. Augment your means, that is, make more money, or diminish your wants. Either will do. But the best plan of all is to do both at the same time. Think of ways to earn more money and diminish your wants. In this way, you'll live well within your means and always have a nice surplus of money. People will say that isn't easy. What's easy? What that's worthwhile is easy. It's said that work never killed anyone. It's worry that does the job. Take the fog of your worries and put it where it really belongs, in 8% of the space it's now occupying. Easier said than done, but possible.
Hello, this is Earl Nightingale. Let's talk about selling one idea at a time. Professional salespeople, marketing experts, and leaders in the advertising profession know the importance of selling one thing at a time. Only catalogs can successfully handle a multitude of items. In a 5-minute speech, or even a long speech, I think it's important to have a single theme, and like a good salesman, you pose the problem, then give your solution. At the end, the problem is restated and the solution quickly summarized. Your opening statement should be an attention-getter. For example, you might say, scientists all over the world are agreed that the world's oceans are dying. A sobering thought, indeed. It captures immediate interest, and everyone's thinking, why, that would presage the end of the world. What are we doing about it? Using an internationally recognized authority as your reference, someone such as Jacques Cousteau, you provide the supporting evidence that your opening remark is indeed true, and then you proceed to outline the possible ways that such a disaster might be averted. At the end, you might say, yes, the oceans of the world are dying today, but if we can marshal the combined efforts of the world's peoples, if we can influence every maritime country to pass laws governing the pollution of the seas by oil tankers. So you end on a note of hope, and at the same time enlist the sympathy of every one of your listeners in your cause. Recent tests indicate that from 10 to 20% of our high school graduates are functionally illiterate. Now that's a stopper. And as with the poisoning of the seas, you establish credence for your subject and then marshal possible answers. Always on the same subject, restate the problem at the end and recap the answer. Not all talks are about social problems, of course. You might be talking about a recent fishing trip, in which case you find something of special interest in the story and open with that. You might say, ounce for ounce, the rainbow trout is one of the gamest fish on earth. It's a much better attention getter and interest stimulator than saying, I want to tell you about my recent fishing trip. A few words about the fish you were after, and then you can work in the rest. 2 weeks ago, John Cooper and I decided to try our luck on the White River near Cotter, Arkansas. It's one of the most naturally beautiful spots in the country, and so on. Stay with the trip and that rainbow trout, the hero of your story. and how good it tasted cooked fresh over an open fire on the bank of the river. Then at the close, to more closely link your listeners to the subject, you might say, if you've never been trout fishing, let me recommend it as one of the world's best ways to forget your problems, clear your brains, and gain a new perspective. And when you hook a rainbow trout, you're in for one of the greatest thrills of a lifetime. In my radio programs, I try to include the listener in my subject and relate it to him or her and his or her needs. If I'm talking about new ideas on the art of managing a company, I'll say that the same ideas apply to managing a family or one's own life. In that way, no one's left out of the picture, and you've got a much better chance of interesting everyone. Pose the problem, if there is one. Give the best possible solution and some good authority for it. Restate the problem in a brief and perhaps dramatic way and summarize the answer. That's the way to have a complete, tidy, well-rounded talk. If there's no problem, find a point of interest and begin with that. Watch your personal pronouns. Keep yourself out of your conversation as much as possible. As with the case of the fishing story, talk about the fish, the beautiful scenery, your companions, other people you met, a humorous incident or two perhaps, but don't keep saying, I did this and I did that. The purpose of this speech is not to talk about you, but rather the subject matter. There's an old saying that small minds talk about things, average minds talk about people, and great minds talk about ideas. What you're selling is almost always an idea. Even if it's painting the house, the idea is the good appearance or the protection of the house. The fishing trip story is about the idea of getting away and going after exciting game fish. One idea, well developed, is the key. If you're talking about a long trip you've made, the idea is the trip itself, even though your talk may include many interesting and unusual events and sights along the way. It's still one theme. Just as a beautiful painting is put together by 1,000 brushstrokes, each stroke makes a contribution to the main theme, the overall picture. And it's the same with a good speech. The difference, I think, between a memorable speech and an ordinary one is usually the degree of involvement on the part of the speaker. If he's wrapped up in his subject, if he knows what he's talking about and is personally involved in it, that comes through. It's not in the words he uses, it's in the feeling that's transmitted. If you want to test this out, listen to news broadcasts on your radio or watch them on television. The performer who's only reading the news from a script or teleprompter, who has no real knowledge or personal interest in it, tends to be superficial and generally dull. The newsman who's been there, who's lived the news, who's made the collection and dissemination of news his life work, brings conviction and interest, involvement, and you and I are caught up in it. We simply know that he knows what he's talking about, while the other person is only reading. It's the same when giving a speech. If the person telling the story about the fishing trip is an avid fisherman and loves it, it comes through. So try to talk about things in which you're very interested and use the single theme formula. It makes preparing a talk much easier and the delivering of it much more effective. Thank you. A very good friend of mine, an outstanding man in many ways and very successful, once found himself in the exquisitely embarrassing position of having his audience stand up and walk out of the hall while he was in the middle of his speech. Every one of them left the room. The exodus was triggered by one man who stood up and voiced the growing resentment of the entire group by shouting at the speaker, "Who do you think you're talking to?" With that, he stalked from the room and the entire audience followed. My friend found himself standing at the podium, gulping and wondering what had happened. How in the world did such a terrible thing happen? Well, perhaps you've already hit on the answer. My friend underestimated his audience. He was a very successful head of a large company. He was accustomed to talking to his own salespeople, especially those who were young and just starting out. They were green and inexperienced. Moreover, he was the boss, and in that position received their unflagging attention and respect. Not so the group that walked out. They were highly trained professionals, mature and well-educated. Their organization had arranged for my friend to speak to them because of his success and reputation as a business leader. He talked to them as though they were a bunch of children. Without thinking, he began his tirade, as he had done so many times with a room full of new salesmen. They simply wouldn't stand for it. They were offended and outraged. My friend learned a lesson he should not have had to learn. Before you make a speech, think about the group you're going to speak to. Chances are it includes some very successful people. If you're talking to a sales organization, you may be talking to some people who do a lot better than you do and who know more about the subject you've chosen. You can still make a valuable contribution in an excellent and much appreciated speech, but stay humble. Every human being has a genetic strong point. You may be great at what you do, and you should be, but remember that other people are great in their ways too, and keep a healthy respect for the people you're addressing. I often say something such as, I'm sure there are many people in this audience more qualified to speak on this subject than I, but perhaps we'd all do better with a little reminding from time to time. Will Rogers said that none of us is smart enough to remember all he knows. Such a statement causes people to drop their guard and relax. They think, okay, this guy isn't challenging me, I'll see what he's got to offer. Maybe I'll even pick up an idea or two. If my successful businessman friend had approached his professional group as professionals and indicated that he knew they were seasoned professionals, it would have been a lot better. It would still have been an uninteresting and boring speech, but they may well have put up with it, and he would never have been the wiser. We need to remember that success in one field doesn't qualify us as experts or grant us omniscience in other fields. Quite often when I've been asked to speak for a group, the program chairman has suggested that I talk on a particular subject. I'm quick to tell him that I have the subject I talk about and that that's my main interest, and that I don't tailor-make speeches for special groups. If he wants me, he gets my subject. It's simply a matter of sticking with what you know, what you're really qualified to talk about. Many times I've received letters and calls from people telling me they want to become speakers. I always ask them, what do you want to talk about? It quite often takes them back. They just want to be speakers. They don't have a subject in which they're deeply involved and interested. And I don't think we need more speakers. We need more informed and dedicated people. I know an economist who heads his department at a large financial institution. Every Friday morning there's an officers' meeting, and the head of each department is asked to report. My economist friend's report is always wonderfully interesting and often contains some really funny humor. Everyone looks forward to his report each Friday morning, and he's succeeded in turning what might have been a very dull and uninteresting meeting into one of charm and interest. He knows his subject. He's an excellent economist, and he's comfortable and at ease talking about it. He knows his audience, too. He wouldn't make the same speech to reporters asking him to report on the national economy, nor to an economics class in a local college. In each case, the audience must be taken into consideration. One of the worst things we can ever do is to talk down to our audience. We should stretch them if possible, but never make the mistake of assuming they aren't as smart as we are. That includes talking to young people in junior achievement, 4-H clubs, high school kids, and so on. Make them stretch up to your subject if necessary, but don't ever be patronizing. It offends them deeply, and they quickly recognize that you've underestimated them. They're a lot smarter than you think. We would all rather be overestimated than underestimated. I used to have a physics instructor who had attended seminars conducted by the great Dr. Albert Einstein. He told me that as the distinguished doctor warmed to his subject, you could see the college professors and instructors in the audience dropping out as he passed beyond their grasp of the subject. Eventually, the doctor was talking to himself while his audience listened in amazement. He overestimated their knowledge and understanding, and they loved him for it. Had he talked to them as though they were children, they would have deeply resented it. So, never, ever, under any possible circumstances, sell your audience short. Never underestimate their brains nor their ability to grasp what you're talking about. Before the speech, talk to the officers of the organization or the head of the company or organization about the people you'll be speaking before. He'll give you a good picture of them, and you'll be on much sounder footing. It pays to know your audience. Thank you. There's an excellent golf professional in Wichita, Kansas by the name of O'Brien. He used to work with Babe Zaharias back in the old days. He knows how to take strokes off your game, and he's written a little book about his method entitled Aim and Hang Loose. In a very inadequate nutshell, Gene O'Brien's system is that our minds and bodies know how to do what we want them to do, most especially if we've had some good training. Instead of trying to concentrate on a dozen different things, the stance, the grip, the straight left arm, the slow comeback, the motionless head, the full turn, there are a dozen or more things we could unsuccessfully try to think about in the 3 seconds it takes to hit a golf ball. Instead, Gene O'Brien says we should stand behind the ball and see where we want to go, where we want the ball to land. Once we have that picture clearly in mind, We can take our stance, aim, and hang loose. Chances are we'll hit a pretty good shot. The same excellent advice works well in many personal experiences, in life itself. Aim and hang loose. I know Gene won't mind my using his title. In making a successful talk, we need to do the same kind of thing. Where do we want the ball to go? What is our aiming point? Now let's get that clearly in mind. I've agreed to make a commencement address at the graduation ceremonies of a local high school. I want to convince those young graduates and the other students and parents in the audience that the most important thing we can do in life is become well-educated human beings, and that education is a lifelong process, that it doesn't, can't, and shouldn't end with getting a diploma, which is the old vaccination theory of education. I've been to school, now I don't have to study anymore, is the way many people think about it. Well, when I get through, I will want every person in that hall to fully understand that we're in a race between education and catastrophe in this world, and the best thing we can do to help the situation is to make certain we're not among the dummies, that we need to do a lot of reading and have fine home libraries, and make certain, if we can, that every day finds us a little smarter than we were the day before. I know my aiming point, and I'll spend 30 minutes swinging at it. I'll be prepared. I'll have my notes, the quotations I want, all the ammunition, corroboration, and proof I need. I accepted that speech because I'm such a nut on the importance of education, and I want to convince those young people, the parents may be set in concrete by now, that commencement means the beginning, not the end. Now, just as that system, aim and hang loose, is the key to good golf, it's the key to effective speaking also. If you try to concentrate on your gestures, your stance, your craggy district attorney look, your emphasis, your ringing diphthongs, your wry smile, and so forth and so forth and so forth, you may end by shanking your subject. Hang loose. Be yourself. Forget yourself. Use the best English of which you're capable. Don't think you have to sound like a moron to be thought of as one of the good old boys. But aim and hang loose. Keep your mind on the ball, on your aiming point, and work toward it. In my opinion, it's the key to a great speech. All great athletes and performers have that wonderful hang-loose quality about them. They're never tense or uptight. It's a kind of controlled relaxation. You see it in a great basketball player as he sinks a long shot, and you see it in every sport and great performance. Watch for it, and develop it in your own delivery. Will Rogers used to spin or play with a rope while he was talking. Perry Como's been accused of nearly falling asleep, and the new crop of stars have that same wonderful kind of professionalism, controlled relaxation. They aim and hang loose. Getting back to that golf analogy for a minute, it's been established that one of the best ways to correct a bad golf swing is to watch yourself swinging a club. It can be done with videotape or a home movie camera. Quite often, people seeing their golf swing for the first time break out in helpless laughter or uncontrollable crying. "Do I look like that?" they cry. Similarly, giving your speech at home while a tape player is running is the world's best-known way of finding out how you sound to your audience. You're probably familiar with the fact that you don't sound to others as you sound to yourself. You hear yourself speak from inside your head. Others hear it from the outside, and the two are quite different. Also, you have no way of realizing how you may be slurring or half-pronouncing words until you hear yourself, until you can sit down and critically listen to yourself. One of my pet peeves is the use of the word recognize. Time and again I hear people saying recognize. There's a letter G in there, and it's supposed to be pronounced. Now, you don't have to sound like an English professor, but if you want to make speeches, you owe it to your audience to treat the language with care, clarity, and consideration. Another pet peeve of mine is the use of the plural they when the singular he should be used. Let me give you a common example. When you're talking to a customer, the speaker will say, make sure they understand that a customer is singular. They is plural. It should be, when you're talking to a customer, make sure he understands, and so forth. If you deal only with women customers, it would be she. However, if you deal with both men and women, he is proper, or he or she, but never they, unless you're saying, when speaking to a group of customers, make sure they understand. That's all right. Elementary? Yes, but a common and irritating and egregious mistake. If you don't like the idea of speaking good English, don't make speeches. And when you're preparing your talk, Remember Gene O'Brien's advice. Aim and hang loose. Thank you. You have accepted an invitation to speak before a National Honor Society meeting of high school students. You set aside a time in which to prepare your talk. You accepted the speech because you felt you had something worth saying to young people. And so you ask yourself, what can I say to these young men and women that will be of help to them? You think of your main theme. Let's say it's the importance of continuing education. The importance of not thinking that school represents the total of our educational efforts. At the same time, you know that these young people have been in the educational system for a long time. They may be tired of the daily grind of the classroom, and perhaps the thought of spending the rest of their lives in the educational process will turn them off. You have to show education itself in a new light, and somehow reveal the joy of discovery that comes from studying in the field of our main interest. We don't mind. In fact, we really enjoy studying in those subjects in which we have a strong interest. All right, you've got the speech going, and then you remember that you will be speaking to high school kids, young adults really. You want to be sure that your vocabulary is one that will earn their interest and respect without, at the same time, confusing them with words they may not yet understand. In other words, you want to speak to them in their vocabulary, not the slang vocabulary of teenagers by any means. All attempts by an adult to be one of the gang when it comes to young people will end in embarrassment and ridicule. They're not looking for a pal. They're looking for helpful information and a little inspiration maybe from a person they can respect and believe. So you use an adult vocabulary. These are people in school. They're familiar with words and the educational process, and you'll be making a serious mistake to attempt to talk down to them. It's better to make them stretch to understand than to have to lean down. Any such attempt will be quickly seen as an attempt to be patronizing, and you'll lose your audience. Level with them. Speak from your heart and mind, under control, and give them your best. They'll respond wonderfully. Perhaps the following week you have a talk to make at a meeting of people in your particular profession or line of business. The same rule will apply here, with the exception that you're free to use the jargon of your calling, and whatever large words are called for, your audience will understand you. And next Sunday you've agreed to take over a Sunday school class of 5th graders, children about 10 years old. You prepare your talk to them at their age level. You speak to them in language they can understand. If you're making a speech to a group of people from another country, they'll be delighted if you will speak to them in their own language. You can do that by writing out your speech in English. Remember to keep it short. Have it translated into the language of the people to whom you'll be speaking, and then with the words written phonetically. If you have trouble with the words in the foreign language, and with a foreign language expert to help you, you learn to read the speech effectively in that language. Yes, it takes a little time. If you don't want to take the time, don't accept the speech. Can you imagine a foreign dignitary coming to this country and making his speech in his own language? I think you would expect him to make the speech in English. You don't mind his accent or his difficulty with certain words or his labored pronunciation. You're delighted that he's speaking to you in your own language. And foreigners feel the same way. It takes years to learn a foreign language properly, perhaps, but you can learn to read a short speech in a foreign language over a weekend. I remember reading Philip Wiley's comment that any person can learn how to do a creditable appendectomy in 2 days. Now, that doesn't make him a physician, but one aspect of almost anything can be picked up in a short, concentrated effort. I make it a principle to always arrive for a speech early so that I can talk to the officials of the group. I find out what the people do in their general educational background to make sure they square with what I had believed when I prepared my talk. What's the average age? The idea is to know your audience as well as possible so that you can speak to the people in it in their language. You'll remember that when Bob Hope made his hundreds of appearances before servicemen and women all over the world, he would go to some pains to pick up some of their vocabulary and the names of some of their officers. In that way, he could personalize his performance to that particular unit. Well, we should do the same, without becoming too cute or personal. We just want them to know that we've gone to the trouble to do some research, and that we know to whom we're talking, that we're not just delivering a canned speech without consideration for the people who must sit through it. The speaker who arrives at the last possible moment and is whisked to the stage may be all right for political stumping, but it tends to leave the audience feeling slightly alienated. We used to have a newscaster years ago on a station at which I worked who would dash for the studio at the last instant, arriving at the microphone out of breath just as the engineer was cutting on the microphone. Well, the rest of us felt that it was a phony ploy on his part. And so one afternoon we set the clock in the newsroom 5 minutes ahead. When our histrionic newscaster began his last-minute dash for the studio, he found the door to the newsroom had been locked, and he couldn't get out. As his newsroom clock ticked and indicated that it was time to be on the air, my voice came over his speaker introducing him. Then, silence. Then I came in again and apologized to the listening audience, telling them that I couldn't imagine where John was, and we stalled around like that for 2 or 3 minutes, while he pounded on the newsroom door and screamed to be let out. We let him out in time for his newscast, and this time he was really out of breath. I think that story is important here because it serves to emphasize that there's always enough time for preparation, and that there's no room for phony histrionics. Speak in the best way you know how, in a language your audience can understand. Avoid words or jargon that might not be understood by most of your audience. Never try to sound important, and avoid pedantry, which is an excessive and inappropriate show of learning. When, after hearing a speech, someone can be heard to say, "He talks my language," it can be considered a high compliment indeed. Thank you.